right. Okay, amazing. Just making sure that no stragglers, people keep popping in on me. There we go. Okay. Hi, Zoe.
How's it
Just
going?
scrolling through. Oh, hi, Callie. Thanks for showing up. Okay, let's focus on this thing. I'm just so excited by all of the people that I know and don't know. So my name is Monica Volkmar, and welcome to our turnout troubleshooting session today. This is the second of a series of movement nerd hangouts that I'll be doing for the foreseeable future, every second Friday of the month. And these are free sessions, and each month I'm covering a different theme. Last month we did how to choose the right shoes for you. And all of these sessions are based on what I've learned through the system of movement called Anatomy in Motion, which looks at how the body moves through the gait cycle. And I'll talk a little bit more about anatomy in motion and why it's a useful context for exploring movement in. But I'll just introduce myself really quickly because some of you don't know me, some of you do. So I am out of Toronto, Ontario. And some of you might know me originally from the dance training project blog, danceproject.ca. I stopped writing that a few years ago because I got into working with more than just dancers, and it didn't really feel right to only be writing a dance blog, so I moved on. You might also know me from Dance Stronger, which is my book, my ebook and online training program that I no longer promote, but it still exists. So if you'd like to get your hands on that, I'm happy to share that with you. It's still there sitting around on the internet. I just don't promote it because I don't know, I should maybe do that. But I moved on with my life and now I'm doing some other stuff. You might also, if you were at the iAdams conference in Hong Kong in 2016, when there was the typhoon, you might recognize me. I was one of the presenters there. I did a movement workshop on, it was either on breathing or core training. One of the days got canceled because of the typhoon, so one of my workshops was canceled, unfortunately. So I did one of them, but I can't even remember which one it was. But some of you might have been there, which is kind of cool. And now what I do is I'm a holistic body worker and movement educator and personal trainer in Toronto. And I teach online out of my home studio here. I teach a workshop called Liberated Body, and I teach weekly movement workshops for my students to help them go deeper into this work of understanding how their body was designed to move so they can get more of it out of their movement practice. They can move with less pain and more ease. And so for today, that means we are going to troubleshoot your turnout and your hip mechanics so that you can have a bit more joy with your dancing. So just to share my story about why this work was beneficial for me, is I was a dancer. I went to Ryerson University here in Toronto, and I had to stop dancing around the age of 22 in my 4th year of university because of all the injuries I was having. And I literally could not walk anymore. So I couldn't dance anymore and I had to find a new way. So part of that path for me was, I mean, I was poor, I had no skills, I couldn't do my career path that I was intending to go down. So I chose to go into a career path that would force me to learn how to heal myself and make money doing it. So I chose to be a personal trainer and a body worker practicing Thai massage and craniosacral therapy. And so what I'm sharing with you today is the culmination of some of the stuff that I've learned that helped me with my hips. And the intention originally wasn't to improve my turnout, but just to help my hips feel better, get out of pain, move more healthily. And then I noticed when I went back to dance classes that I was able to access more of my actual turnout that I had. Even though I didn't have more turnout necessarily, I could use whatever I had better and it didn't cause me pain anymore. And I actually felt like in the class, my hips were feeling really good. I wasn't cranking things in an uncomfortable way, but I had come to a place where I understood my body well enough that turnout, using it in class, actually felt nice. And I wasn't forcing it because I had learned how to respect my body's limitations. So that is my wish for you, not necessarily to see crazy wild improvements in your turnout, but learn how to use what you have better and feel better about it. And also learn or feel that after classes that your body isn't super banged up from forcing out your turnout. So let's just talk about what we're going to cover today. We kind of have 4 parts. We're going to do a little lecture. talk about some hip mechanics, talk about some key concepts that we're going to cover in the movement session. We're going to go through a couple of assessments to look at what your turnout potential is and what your hip potential is right now. And then we're going to do a movement exploration to unlock some of your hips movement potential. And then we're going to check back in again to see if anything has changed for you. I just want to give a little shout out right now to everyone who I surveyed. There are some dance educators here in the room right now, in the Zoom room, who they are dance educators, rehab professionals, movement specialists, and they contributed some of their pro tips to a resource that I put together that you'll all be getting afterwards. So this is a bonus resource. It's about 20 pages long right now, and it's some tips about how to optimize and assess your turnout from some of the dance educators from around the world. So thank you to you guys. I'm really grateful that you took the time to answer some of my questions so I could put them together into this bonus resource for you. Okay, so let's get into the work. Our intentions today are really to understand the mechanics of the hip joint. What is the hip? It seems like a no-brainer question, but I think we ought not to take it for granted that some of us don't really appreciate what the hip joint actually is. I know that I didn't really understand what the hip joint was until maybe, I don't know, a couple of years into my training as a movement educator. I thought I knew what the hip was, but I actually intellectually, I knew what it was, but in my body, I didn't know what it was. So the idea is to give you the embodied experience of really knowing what your hip is, not just thinking you know what your hip is, but really truly knowing what your hips are. Okay. So we also want to understand what the hip joint is designed to do beyond just turnout in the dance context, but appreciate that you were a human being first before you were born a dancer. You came out of the womb as a human, not as a fully blown dancer. So we want to appreciate that to help you with your dancing, we might need to support the human that you are and make sure that you have all of the potential for hip movements that a human being should have so that you can carry that over into any activity that you do, which for you guys here is probably dance, probably something like ballet or a technique that requires turnouts. So this means that we're going to look at how the hip should move as we walk. Let's talk a little bit about the gait cycle. So the gait cycle, G-A-I-T, not G-A-T-E, is the walking cycle. And in Anatomy in Motion, the system that I'm trained in, that I'm going to be sharing with you today, we look at how the body moves through from one step to the next and understand that every single motion that the body can do, every joint action, it happens in the time span of 0.6 to 0.8 seconds that it takes to go from one foot to the other. So in less than a second, your hips need to go through all the potential for motion they have in all three planes of motion. So in the frontal plane, transverse plane, and sagittal plane, those are the three planes of motion. Today, we're going to zoom into the transverse plane, which is rotation. So turning out and turning in. So there's two other planes of motion that we'll need to look at, but for today, we're just covering the transverse plane, which is external and internal rotation. And in each footstep, your whole hip goes from all the way internal rotation, all the way into external rotation with every step you take. So if you do not have access to one end of that movement spectrum, then with each step, you might be reinforcing that imbalanced habit. And so we want to make sure that you have that movement potential accessible to you so that with each footstep, you can use it. And then having that full potential, you can then use it for whatever activity that you want to do, be that dance or what have you. So that's why gait is important to look at. It's our most fundamental of fundamental movement patterns. No one had to teach us how to walk. We just know how to walk because it's ingrained in our DNA. And our body recognizes these mechanics as very useful, very efficient, and a very excellent context for healing accidents, injuries, and strains. Other movement patterns are more like skills that we develop very consciously, whereas gait, we learned unconsciously. We just had it. We didn't have to consciously learn it. No one had to teach us that. So it's very fundamental, a very valuable, efficient movement pattern to be able to accomplish. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. In today's session, it's not going to be a very typical session. I'll just say right up front, I'm a little different. So we're not going to be doing the usual turnout-based exercises. We're going to be exploring some things that don't look very dancey at all. They're very human, very fundamental movement patterns. So you'll just have to see what I mean. But our intention is to get our hips, pelvis, spine, feet, knees mobilized and differentiated so that they know how to do the things that they're supposed to be able to do, not just moving as one clump together. We want to discover what your compensations are. So we all use compensations for turnout. The holy grail in ballet is to get the turnout coming from the hip joints themselves. So really to isolate and differentiate the movement of the femur in the socket turning out. And we see most other contributing factors to turnout, like from the knees or from the feet and the ankles. We mostly see those as bad and compensatory, but I want to flip that a little bit so that we can embrace our compensations. I don't think that our compensations are bad. I think that they can become problematic if we're not aware of them. And I think that we want to be able to make you bulletproof to your compensations, and that requires that you become aware of what your compensations are. So are you a person who twists out through your knees? Are you a person who anterior tilts your pelvis or tucks under your pelvis? What are the strategies that you use? And then can we increase your buffer to use those before they cause your body harm? So if you're gonna be one of those people that twists your knees out, because I sure am, and I'm probably not gonna stop doing that no matter my best intentions, I wanna make sure that I have bulletproof knees, so that if I push a little bit into my knee compensation, I know it's not gonna hurt me because I've made my buffer for using that compensation a little bit bigger. And that's also going to contribute to what I like to call full body turnout. Because I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a professional dancer. I was not genetically endowed with the hips to do that. So I need my compensations. I really need them. I need my full body turnout in order to accomplish the lines. They're not going to look like Svetlana Zakharova's lines, but they're going to be my lines. And I want to use my whole body to be able to do that, not just limit myself to using my hips and think that everything else is bad, because that's going to put extra strain on my system and that's going to make me feel bad about myself. And I want you to know the most important thing about today is that just because you might not have awesome turnout, that doesn't mean you're not an awesome dancer. And that was my biggest pitfall. My biggest mind block was that I got really stuck on needing to have perfect technique and perfect turnout. And I had a teacher who was really old school and told us that if we weren't perfect, then we were literally nothing. She was a little hardcore. She was an awesome teacher, but she was not very good for my mental health. So I want you to know that just because your turnout isn't amazing, there are so many other qualities that go into making a dancer excellent. And having this mind block around needing to have perfect turnout and needing to not compensate will put extra tension in your system, and it will put extra tension in your mind, and it will block you from that free-flowing expression in your body that we want to get, that makes dancing so enjoyable. Okay? And let's see, what else do I need to say? Yeah, so we're just gonna explore some movements, and I want you to be really open about these movements because they're gonna be different. I might be asking you to do things that you've been taught are bad to do. And I know that a lot of you are perfectionists. So if you are a perfectionist like me, because most dancers are, if I ask you to do something, you're probably gonna do it like 150%. And I want you to just try to ease up a little bit and do things 20%, and know that if you do the things I'm asking you to do with 20% of your intensity, you're probably going to push to 100% because that's how you are as a perfectionist. If that doesn't describe you and you're not a perfectionist, then just forget about that. But I know myself and a lot of the clients that I work with, they just push too hard. And a lot of these movements I'll be showing you are kind of subtle, really specific, really require your awareness. And if you're going too hard and too fast, you'll skip over all the beautiful details. And if you're going too fast, you're only going to be moving in the way you already know how to move. And if you go slowly, you'll be able to encounter those beautiful spaces to try something different that will unlock extra movement potential that you're not currently accessing. So go slow. Remember, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So get to fast results, we go slow so we can go smooth and get to the fast results. All right. So before we get into some of the concepts I want to cover today, a little lecture, I would like to give a shout out to those who maybe are not here on the call, but have generously donated some prizes for the giveaway. So if you're here now and you haven't done it already, type your name into the chat box so that I have your name on file so that I can put it into the draw to win one of these 4 awesome giveaways that have been generously donated by some amazing people. So the first one is from Kaleida Dance. Kaleida, aka Kim, is from Germany, and she is a professional belly dancer, and she has an online belly dance school. And she has generously donated one of her online programs called Shimmy Boost, which is all about shimmies. If you've ever tried to do a shimmy, they are hard as heck. Like, oh my gosh. Talk about isolating frontal plane pelvis motion, it's crazy. So if you are interested in that, then definitely put your name in the chat box. The next giveaway I have is from Galina Denzel of Eat, Move, Live 52, and she's donated a whole 8-course movement bundle. She has courses that are for foot health, for back health, for all sorts of like whole body, amazing, awesome, healthy movement stuff. She's a Katie Bowman student, so she does nutritious movement, whatchamacallit, restorative movement stuff. So she's really awesome if you're looking to optimize how your body moves and feels. Our next giveaway is from David Gray, Rehab. He's an anatomy and motion practitioner as well, and he has a program called Lower Body Basics, which is really popular right now in the rehab and performance community. And it's all about optimizing the movement of the pelvis, hips, and lower leg, knees and ankles and feet. And I think you'll really love it. It's not dance specific, but it's human specific, so it's for you. And our last one, what we just added this morning, is from Celine of Neuroscience of Dance. And I'm going to get her to say a little bit about this at the end of today, but she has a workshop coming up on October 24th online that's called, hope I don't butcher this, Neuroscience of Dance and Mental Well-Being. It's an online workshop, and I think you're really going to love it if you enjoy neuroscience and dance and how the two collide for well-being and improving your dancing and improving your brain health. So we can chat a bit more about that after. And as I mentioned, I have a bonus resource of all the Turnout pro tips I gathered from some of you who are here now and from some people that are not here on the call but couldn't make it online at this time live. So I'll be sending out that resource. It's right now a 15-page PDF document with all sorts of tips. Anyway, so I have some goodies for you. All right, so let's talk about what is the hip joint. I did a little Instagram live video about this to practice my rehearsal of this delivery. So we're going to do a hip mechanics 101. What's the hip? Let's say this is your pelvis and this is your femur, because I don't have a fancy anatomically correct hip model, so this is it, but it works just as well. So let's say this is the pelvis, this is the center line of your pelvis, and the bottom here, this is the pubic symphysis, so the bottom of your pelvis. The pen is your femur, and let's say this clip of the pen is the midline of your femur. So what is the hip? If the femur fits into the hip socket, the acetabulum, we call the hip the space where these two bones meet. So interestingly, the hip joint is actually nothing. It's just a space. So when we're talking about the motions of the hip, what we're going to do today is reference the motion of the pelvis as an individual structure, and we're going to reference the motion of the femur as an individual structure, and what those two bones do when we're looking at how to optimize turnout. Now, if you are not an anatomy person, don't worry. I'm going to get a little bit into some functional biomechanics anatomy type stuff, but you're going to be just fine if you have no idea what a hip external rotation is. We're going to go through it now, and I think you'll be just fine if you follow along with the movements we go through. So what is hip external rotation? What is external rotation of any joint for that matter? So technically speaking, an external rotation of a joint is if we have two structures that make a joint, because that's what a joint is. It's where two bones collide and interact with each other. We want to reference the structure below, and when the structure below, so in this case the femur, is rotated outwards from midline, that's what we call an external rotation of that joint, of that space. So if we have the femur turned away from midline in relation to the upper structure, then we have an external rotation because the bottom bone is turned away from midline farther than the top bone. What that does is it creates space at the front of the joint, all the tissues across the front here will be opened up, elongated, and that's what we call an external rotation of a joint. And in this case, it's the hip we're looking at. So in the gait cycle, there are several different ways that our hips experience external rotation depending on which phase of gait we're in. So if we're looking for optimizing the full potential of hip external rotation, we don't want to just look at it in the context of how we do it in dance. We want to optimize your ability to access it in all of the phases of the gait cycle that it should happen. So you have all those options available for you to use. So I want us to look at the 5 different ways that our hip can access external rotation. First way. So let's say this is neutral. So the first way is your pelvis does nothing and the femur rotates away from midline. Pelvis does nothing, femur rotates away from midline. This is the simplest way of thinking about it, and this is how we are told to access turnout in dance. Keep the pelvis still and rotate the femur externally. But that's just one of the ways, and that's what we call hip dissociation. And so when we're doing activities that our teachers are telling us to visualize the deep rotators of the hip, turning the femur out, that's this version of hip rotation that we're looking at. But there are 4 other different ways that we can access a hip external rotation that our bodies should be able to do, both for full potential performance-wise and health-wise. So the second way, let's say that the pelvis and the femur are rotating the same direction, which happens when you take a step forwards. So if the pelvis and the femur are rotating the same direction, let's say they're rotating the same amount. There's actually 0 motion happening at the hip joint right now because they're moving as a clump. The pelvis and the femur are moving the same amount together. So there's no joint interaction here. There's no movement in the actual bones against each other. They're just moving as a clump. So what we'd have to have happen for a hip external rotation is for the femur to actually rotate a little bit further in the socket than the pelvis is going. So can you see that? The pelvis and the femur are rotating in the same direction, in this case to the right, but the femur is going to rotate a little bit further into its end range in the hip socket, and that's what's going to give us a full hip external rotation in the context of gait. So in dance, we look at hip external rotation with the pelvis staying still, just moving the femur. In the gait cycle, we get full hip external rotation when the leg is behind us. Both the hip and the pelvis are moving in the same direction, and the femur is externally rotated. If you can see this, I'll just dislocate the hip and move it forwards. The femur is moving a little bit further in the socket than the pelvis is rotating in order to have that movement in the actual joint itself. Okay, so we're going to explore that today as an exercise, what that actually feels like. Now, the third way of getting hip external rotation. So what if the femur stays still, femur does nothing, and the pelvis rotates away from it? So you can see how we're still getting that play between the 2 bones. The femur is rolling against the femur, and we have an opening of the space at the front of the hip. The bottom bone is pointing farther from midline than the top bone. The femur hasn't moved actually on its own, but the pelvis has rotated away from it. And that's what's causing the hip external rotation. Okay, number 4, this is an interesting one. So let's say the pelvis and the femur are rotating the opposite direction. So now let's say we took a step forwards, and this is the leg that's coming to the front leg. The femur and the pelvis are going to be rotating the opposite or the same direction. They're both going to my left. Again, if they're going in the same quantity, the same rate, there's 0 motion in the actual hip joint. There's actually nothing happening. They're just moving as one clump. Not very useful to move as a clump. So what actually happens when we walk is the pelvis will rotate a little bit further from the femur in the same direction, which creates the external rotation of the hip. So they both rotate the same direction. The pelvis starts to rotate a little further, and then we get an external rotation of the hip, because now we still have the situation where there is the bottom structure pointing more away from midline than the top structure. Interestingly about this is that we have the femur rotating internally, but the hip externally rotating. And I know that might be a little bit of a mind fuck, pardon my French. Don't worry. We're going to do this in an exercise and it will make sense. But know that there is a phase in the gait cycle where the pelvis and the femur rotate the same direction. The femur is internally rotating, but the hip is externally rotating because the pelvis is traveling further, opening up the structure at the front of the hip. Okay, and the fifth way we can get hip external rotation, start back at neutral. What if both structures move opposite directions from each other? So that's also a thing that can happen. This happens at the heel strike phase of gait. So at different phases in the gait cycle, the pelvis and the femur have different joint interactions with each other that all accomplish a movement called external rotation of the hip. So that's what I wanted you to take away from that. Not that you need to memorize the 5 ways the hip externally rotates, but know that there's a little bit more to it than just twisting the femur out in the socket. There are different ways the femur and the pelvis interact with each other to accomplish hip external rotation, depending on which phase of gait your body is currently in. And some of us, our bodies are stuck a little bit in one moment in time, and we have a little bit of trouble getting out of the particular position that our bodies are stuck in. And so my intention for us today is to explore these different ways that our bodies experience this hip external rotation, in hopes that your body will meet one of the experiences that sets it free. So some of these movements might be really useful for you, and some of them might not be great for you. That's why I want you to only do 20% effort in the chance that I give you an exercise that your body doesn't like because it doesn't need it. Don't go hardcore into that exercise. Start off gently, go in slowly, suss out if it's right for you before giving it 100% of your effort. Because there will be some things that really work really well for some of you and some things that work really not well at all for others. All right. So I want to share with you a concept, one of the rules of motion that I was taught by Gary Ward of Anatomy in Motion, one of my movement mentors. So he's the creator of Anatomy in Motion and the model of the gait cycle that is called the flow motion model that I work with in my practice. And one of his rules is that muscles must lengthen before they contract. So I want you to think about a muscle like an elastic band. And the way that they function in the gait cycle is it's kind of a controlled fall. So we don't necessarily need to create concentric, squeezy contractions when we walk. But what happens instead is that muscles load, meaning like an elastic band, they stretch out under load. So it's an eccentric load. And then when the muscle has reached its full eccentric load, it gives it no option but to contract based on that stimulus. And it's like a catapult, it slings back and creates momentum for the joint to return in the opposite direction. So that's why it's really important to appreciate muscles lengthen before they contract for ease and efficiency in the gait cycle. Now that's a rule that applies only to the gait cycle. When you're working out at the gym and you're lifting weights, muscles contract to move the weight. In the gait cycle, muscles lengthen before they contract. Muscles load to explode. So what we're going to be looking at in our exercises today, we're not looking for concentric contractions. So we're not going to be doing clamshells and things like that concentrically squeeze muscles and shorten them. We're going to be looking for eccentric loading. So I'm going to be asking you to look for eccentric loading in the glutes, eccentric loading of the adductors, eccentric loading of the hip flexors. So we're looking for stretchy feelings of the muscle as our indicators that we're doing the right joint motions. And if you're not feeling the loading, the eccentric loading, the stretchy feeling, then you're probably not accessing the joint motion we're looking for. Okay, so I'll remind you again about that as we go. And I'd just like us to talk a bit about the idea of joint access versus joint mobility, because I am not a person that does a lot of stretching and I don't do a lot of mobility work, but I do a lot of work to help me access joint motion. And I think there's a difference here. And I wish I knew a scientific explanation of the difference, but I do know the embodied difference because I've felt it and I've taught it, and other people have spoken about that there is a difference between accessing a joint and its potential versus just stretching and mobilizing a joint. So joint access, it's kind of like the joint gaining an understanding of itself. It's giving the opportunity for the joint to assess itself and understand where it is in space. So it's a little bit beyond proprioception even. And it's like this inner awareness of the joint. So if we're looking at the hip, for example, how would the hip joint know itself? Well, it would know that it's two components. It's a femur and a pelvis. And it would know that those two structures can move independently of each other. And then it would know how to move in interaction with each other in harmonious relationship based on the context at hand, which gives it unlimited possibilities for what that joint can do. Whereas we can stretch joints that we don't have access to. And that's what I was doing. And that's what caused me a lot of injuries. I had a pretty bad hamstring injury back in the day that forced me to stop dancing. And I think that one of the reasons why is that I was stretching a muscle that I didn't have access to the joint that it covered. So the hamstring crosses the hip joint at the back. And when you lift your leg in the air, or you do like a forward bend, you stretch the hamstring out. But I actually didn't have access to that joint. If we're talking about these 5 different ways that the hip can rotate, there's 5 different ways that the hip can flex and extend, and every single joint motion, there's 5 ways of accessing that. I didn't have any of those access abilities because my joint was kind of like this clump, but I could still stretch the muscle out. But that stretching wasn't giving any information to my joint about how it could move. It was just stretching the muscle, trying to make it submit to my will. Just lengthen, why don't you? And that didn't really teach my body to do anything. It didn't give my muscles something to do. It didn't give it that stimulation to load and then explode. It was just kind of like just tugging on it. And it was really uncomfortable, but I didn't know any better at the time. So joint access is giving information to the joint. And the primary goal isn't to stretch. The outcome is you'll feel a stretch. So it's a little bit backwards. The primary goal of a stretch is to make that muscle lengthen and feel the stretch. The primary goal of accessing a joint is to differentiate the bones. And the secondary result is you'll feel a stretch that will indicate that you're differentiating the bones. So that will become more clear when we actually get up and do it. Okay, if anyone has science on how that works, I'd love to hear it. I don't know the science of it, I just know the experience of it and how to teach it. Anyway, and I just want to remind you one last time, we're going to embrace our compensatory patterns today. We're not going to demonize them. We're going to know they're not the best thing to do for our bodies, but we're not going to demonize them. We're going to reinforce our ability to do them safely, increase our buffer for them so that when we do use them, because we're going to use them, that we're using them in the safest way possible. So we're going to be looking at in our assessments, what are your specific compensations? Are you pronating your feet excessively? Are you externally rotating out through your knees excessively? Are you anteriorly or posteriorly tilting your pelvis excessively? Are you flexing or extending your lumbar spine excessively? Are you tilting your rib cage excessively? All of these things are fair game. Are you clenching your jaw excessively because you're clenching to get your turnout? So we would just want to be hyper aware of what those things are so we can embrace them, increase our buffer for them, and then move on with our lives. So why don't we just get started with some assessments? So at the end of the session, we're going to be doing some Q&A. So as we go, I'd just like you to write down if any questions come up as we go, and then save them for the end, and we'll dedicate some time to answer some questions, okay? So let me just check the time now. Okay, cool. So I'm hoping this movement session will take about 45 minutes, hopefully not too much longer than that. I tend to overplan, so I'm very ambitious about all the things we'll accomplish today, whether or not we actually get through them all. So for those of you who came a little bit late, what you're gonna need for our assessments is 2 towels. Can you guess what we're gonna do with those 2 towels? This is the #1 turnout assessment that when I surveyed all the dance educators, almost everybody gave me this assessment. So I was like, well, we better use this assessment since everyone's talking about it. Instead of towels, I'm going to be using my awesome microfiber slippers that clean my house while I walk around in my house because I'm a terrible cleaner. So you're gonna need 2 towels, a pen and a paper to make some notes along the way. All right, so let's stand up and let's do this thing. Let's troubleshoot some turnout stuff. And I have a lot of notes. So if I look down to reference my notes, it's not because I'm not smart. Well, I don't think I'm that smart, but it's not because I am not prepared. It's because I just want to make sure we get through all the things. I have so much to share with you. Oh, one other thing. I'd like you for this assessment to have a phone ready, like a camera, so you can take a little snapshot of your before and then compare it with the after photo, okay? So if you have a smartphone or a camera, just have that handy. Let's stand up. Find a spot in your room. And ideally you have a slippery floor for this. So I'm actually gonna stand on my, oh, you can't see my face. Let's move this back. That's better. So make sure you have a slippery floor. And I'd like you to just stand on your 2 feet to begin with. Before we do anything, how I generally start my movement sessions when I'm teaching my liberated body students and my in-person clients, as I just want them to settle into the bones of their feet and get a sense of where they're sensing their foot pressure. So do this now. With your feet side by side, don't try to stand with good posture, because I don't care. I don't even know what good posture is, to be quite honest. It's just a thing we made up to make ourselves feel bad about ourselves. Just kidding, kind of. Where are you feeling the pressure in your feet? More on the right foot, more on the left foot? More on the insides of your feet, more on the outsides of your feet? Is there one patch of pressure that really stands out? Just get a sense of that. Let your body drift around until you find a resting spot. And if you'd like to make a note of this, you can draw your 2 foot shapes, shade in the spots. I'm not going to say too much about why we're sensing your foot pressures today, but this is an integral part of my Liberated Body workshop. It helps us to track the way our body is changing over time doing the work. Okay, so let's do our first turnout assessment. I have 2 dance-specific assessments and then several human-specific assessments. So I'm going to put on my fluffy microfiber amazing slippers. These are seriously the best $15 investment I ever made. So you all know this one. You've probably done this one yourself, or if you have dance students. Put your feet side by side. Have your feet pointing parallel. Now remember that first version of hip external rotation, the hip dissociation. So we're going to keep our pelvis perfectly still and visualize right from the top of your femurs in the socket there. Visualize them rotating out. Oh, you should have your phone in your hand while you do this, because I'm going to get you to take a snapshot from above at what your functional turnout is. Okay? So start to turn out from your hips. Don't cheat it. Be super honest about what you can do. Don't worry if one foot's going farther than the other. Try to do this without any compensation. So be super, super honest. No bending your knees, no movement in your pelvis, no movement in your rib cage. Just what can you access from the top of your femur? You only get one chance at this. So if you're not warmed up, well, that's a factor too. And now I want you to look down and just see the honest truth, like, wow, that really sucks. I'm talking to myself here. And I'm gonna do this too. I'm just gonna take a quick snapshot from above of what my turnout was before, and then forget about it. Okay, so get that, that's your information. Either use the 2 towels under your feet, or if you have fancy discs, or if you have awesome slippers or fluffy socks. All right, let's move on. We're gonna go kind of quickly through these things. So the next dance specific assessment we're gonna do, oh, actually I lied, I wanted to do something else there. Okay, so go back to your towels. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Just too much caffeine in my system. Actually, I'm a fast metabolizer of caffeine, which means I can have a lot of it and it doesn't affect me. It just makes me normal, which is kind of sad. Okay, so the next assessment we're gonna do is as we rotate our hips out. The first assessment was the functional range. How far can you go before you reach your natural limit without compensations? Now I want you to actually compensate here. If you were gonna go for your best looking turnout in class, what compensations are you gonna do? So start to force it a little further. What do you notice happening? So what I'm noticing, and check off if you're like me, my feet are pronating. I'm rolling onto the insides of my feet. I'm bending my knees and I'm twisting my knees out, because when the knees bend, that gives them more access to twist. So in order to twist from my knees, I'm noticing my knees are bending, my feet are pronating. I'm gripping my butt, which is one of the tips, one of the biggest mistakes that Marissa Schaefer, she's a dance PT in New York, and her top, I guess, what was the wording exactly? What's the biggest mistake you see? I asked her, and she said butt gripping. And that's totally what I'm doing right now. I'm gripping my butt. I also noticed that I'm doing a bit of an anterior tilt with my pelvis. And if I really force it out, yeah, I'm in a really big anterior tilt. So this is what I did for like 10 years of my life. No wonder I have problems. So I just want you to make a mental note. What are your compensations? What did you just notice yourself doing? And they might be different from mine. You might be someone who actually does a tuck under with your pelvis to get more turnout. I can't do that. My body just physically cannot do a posterior tilt. So maybe you're different. Maybe you notice when you force your turnout, you posterior tilt your pelvis, you tuck it under. Maybe you notice you hyperextend your knees. Maybe you actually roll to the outsides of your feet. Maybe you're the opposite of me. I want you to know what your specific compensatory strategies are and make a note of those. Write down what you notice. There's no right or wrong answer. Just write down one thing that you noticed that your body did when you went a little bit beyond what your honest range was. Okay. So let's go onto the floor now. We're gonna do a final dance specific-ish assessment of our hip rotation. This one is going to look at hip internal and external rotation. And just to say a little point about internal rotation of the hip internal rotation is important. Is my microphone even on? I don't even know if it's on. I have the microphone plugged in, but I don't think it's on. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes. Or I can hear you.
Just type in if you can hear me okay, because I don't think I even have my microphone on. It's plugged in, but it's not necessarily turned on. Okay, you can hear me. All right, well, I'm going to turn my microphone on now and to hear me better. Okay, if you guys can hear me, just say yes in the chat box. Is this okay? Is this thing on? Okay, awesome. Thanks, guys. Wow. I'm good at my job, I promise. Okay, so on the floor, hip internal rotation is important for 2 reasons. One, we never want to demonize one range of motion that the body can do in favor of another, because that's going to limit our movement options, and over time that can cause some problems with the joint health of in itself. But the number 2 reason why we want to make sure we're also working on hip internal rotation is because remember that idea of muscles must lengthen in order to contract. So when the hip internally rotates, all the muscles that externally rotate the hip are going to load, giving them the stimulation to contract. So if we want good hip external rotation, we want those muscles to be given something to do, to be given some stimulation to do something for us, we need to also allow them to load, which happens when the hip internally rotates. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a second. Let's go on your back, and we're going to do a very basic hip external internal rotation assessment in supine 90 degrees. So bring one leg up to 90 degrees. And you're going to put your hands on either side of your femur. And I want you to make sure your femur is vertical, meaning it's not in or out. I'm going to turn this way so that you can see me a little bit better. So don't have your leg out, don't have it crossed over, vertical femur. And just stabilize it with your hands. And I want you to really honestly turn your femur in the socket without doing anything else with your pelvis. Don't twist your pelvis on the floor. Don't let your leg deviate out of that vertical path. And just check in, okay, what's my external rotation like? And then, keeping your hips stabilized, keeping it stacked vertically, rotate your hip internally, and wow, that's how much I have. So be aware of the moment at which your pelvis starts to hike up. Now, if we're talking about joint access, we want to actually differentiate the femur movement from the pelvis movement. So only go until the moment at which you notice your femur and your pelvis starting to move together as one clump. And I want you to just roughly gauge the degrees that you have. So for me, my external rotation here, I've got maybe like 45 degrees. And then internal rotation, like I suck at math and geometry, so I've got maybe like 9 degrees, 8.5 degrees of internal rotation. That's pretty abysmal. I forget what the standard is, the gold standard, but it's definitely higher than 8 degrees. Okay, try your other leg. I'll look up those numbers and I have them in a book somewhere, but whatever should be means. Anyway, so let's do your other leg. Stack your femur vertically. Notice if you're rocked all the way to one side of your pelvis, and I'd like you to be right smack in the center of your pelvis on the floor. Let's start to rotate your femur externally in the socket, thinking of the movement coming from the leg itself, not from anything else. And it looks like on this side I have maybe 35 degrees. I'm just making these numbers up because I really can't gauge this accurately. And wow, it looks like just getting to neutral with this leg, I can barely go into internal rotation. I have about 1 degree of internal rotation on my left before my pelvis and my femur start to clump together. I can definitely go further, but this is just me scrubbing my, be very honest. How much can you actually get? I can get 1 degree. Wow, this is embarrassing. But that's my truth. That's what we're after here. All right, so make any notes. Make any notes that you need to make. And now we're going to go through a couple of dance-specific, or not dance-specific, gait-specific joint mechanics assessments. Just going to make sure my microphone's still in there. Okay, great. So stand up. So what we're looking at next is how our femur and our pelvis should move in relationship with each other when we walk. Is our body currently capable of doing those joint mechanics? So we're going to first look at the pelvis and how it moves into anterior and posterior tilt. For those of you who have done my liberated body workshop or who are anatomy and motion students, you know these assessments already. So let's just go a little bit deeper into them. So we're going to reference these 2 bones at the front of your pelvis. We'll call them the pelvis bones, just for simplicity. To go into an anterior pelvis tilt, I'd like you to take these 2 bones and tilt them forwards and down to the floor. So if your pelvis was a bowl of soup, you should feel the soup bowl spilling out the front. So soup is pouring onto the floor out the front of your bowl. Go gently into this and just gauge the range of motion and what it feels like. Next, let's go the opposite direction into a posterior tilt. So these two pelvis bones are going to be going back and up and back. So the bowl of soup, you're spilling out behind you onto the floor. Do that again, anterior tilt. And I want you to first get a gauge of which direction is more comfortable, which do you have more range of motion. Now, the second thing we're going to pay attention to is how are our femurs moving in our sockets as we do this anterior and posterior tilt, because there is a specific joint interaction we want to have there that should happen with every step that you take. So what you're going to do this time is put your hands on the front of your thighs and really tune in to the rolling inwards and outwards motion of your thighs as you do these pelvis tilts. So as you anterior tilt your pelvis, I want you to feel with your hands which direction are your femurs rolling. Are they going into an internal rotation? Are they doing nothing? Or are they going into an external rotation? Which way are your thighs going? And is one doing something different than the other? I can tell you mine for sure are. Let's do the opposite way. So if you do a posterior tilt, you're tucking your pelvis, spilling the soup bowl back. Feel your femurs. Which direction are they rolling? Are they going into an external rotation, an internal rotation, or doing absolutely nothing? And is it different from one leg to the other? So now I'll tell you what we'd like to feel happening here. As you anterior tilt your pelvis, you should be feeling your thighs both internally rotating. This is a natural coupled joint interaction that should happen when you walk. As you posterior tilt your pelvis, the opposite is true. You should feel your legs both externally rotating in the sockets. Again, this is a natural coupled joint interaction that should naturally happen. You shouldn't have to consciously control this. We want to know if these mechanics are currently something your body can do. And if they're not happening, we want to be able to restore them to you. So for me, my pelvis, when it anterior tilts, my right leg rotates in really easily. My left leg doesn't go. Do you remember how my left leg has like 0 internal rotation? Well, it's not happening here either. And as I posterior tilt, again, my left thigh doesn't really rotate. My right thigh has a lot of range. So what's going on with you? Just jot down a note of what was happening. Now, there's some other mechanics I wanted to look at as it relates to anterior and posterior pelvis tilts, but I think we're going to skip through those because otherwise we're going to be here for 3 hours. So let's move along to our next gait-specific assessment. And you can learn more about the other assessments if you just go to, well, I'll share with you a link to where you can learn more about some of the stuff that I do online. Anyway, not to get too self-promotional right now. This is all about you and your hip. So we're going to do some pelvis rotations right and left. So let's pretend you're in a glass tube. You can't break the tube by shifting forwards and back. We're going to be looking purely at the rotation of your pelvis. So twist your pelvis all the way one direction. And I'd like you to have your hands on your shoulders so you can feel if you're keeping your shoulders directly to the front. First, get a global sense of what this range of motion feels like. Can you differentiate your pelvis from your ribcage, or do you rotate all in one chunk? Some people cannot separate their ribcage from their pelvis. If that's you, you're going to have a really hard time accessing rotation of your hips. So is one way easier than the other? Just make a quick note of that. easier to the right or easier to the left. Next, I want you to tune into the feeling of your leg rotating with you. So let's say you're rotating to the right with your pelvis. So your drawstring of your pants is pointing off to the right. You should be able to feel your right leg rotating externally and even all the way down into your ankle, external rotation. And you should be able to look down and see that your foot is supinating, meaning that the arch is lifting and your pressure is going towards the outside of your foot. If there's good communication from the hip down to your foot, you should be experiencing the other direction as you rotate your pelvis to the left, without moving your rib cage. Is your ankle externally rotating? If you look down, is the pressure going into the outside and back of that foot? Those are into external rotation. So make a little note of that. I'm getting some chats in here about is it my sound quality? Interesting. Okay. Well, if my sound gets worse and worse and worse, let me know, guys. I might want to switch off my mic and just go with the natural sound. Okay. Thanks, guys. All right. So those are our two assessments we're going to use just to look at our gait-specific joint mechanics. So one thing that I want you to appreciate is that as the pelvis posterior tilts, the femurs both externally rotate. Now, a lot of us use a posterior tilt of the pelvis and a squeezing the butt in order to get more turnout. So I'm not saying that we should use a posterior tilt to get more external rotation, but that what we'd like to see is for those two movements to be able to couple together naturally. And then we can choose whether or not we want to use that option or not. But if you can't do it at all naturally, then your body is going to have less options for movement available to it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to go through the pelvis and then the hips, and then look at the feet. And we're going to work our way down and feet in movement to see how it goes for you guys. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that you have optimal access to your pelvis into anterior and posterior tilt. So to do that, we're going to do one of my favorite exercises, the supine cog lying on the floor. So the intention of this movement is really to access full range anterior tilt of the pelvis, posterior tilt of the pelvis in a non-weight bearing situation, so you don't have to deal with anything below the waist interfering with your range of motion. So we're going to free up the lower back and the pelvis. So I'll guide you through this. Lie on your back and follow along. So on your back, feet flat on the floor. This is a whole body movement, not just the pelvis, but we're going to be guiding it with the pelvis. So I'd like you to begin by rolling down on your pelvis towards your tailbone. So you're initiating an anterior tilt. You really gently rock down. Those of you who have done my workshops before, you know what the rest of your spine is going to do here. As you anterior tilt your pelvis, you should feel your lumbar spine starting to lift off the floor. You should feel that movement trickling all the way up into your thoracic spine as well. So your upper spine is going to be lifting off the floor. So your whole spine is creating a rainbow shape. Now, in the gait cycle, we want our head, our skull, and our pelvis to be going the same direction. So what I want you to feel is that your chin rocks down towards your chest as you do this. So as the pelvis tilts down towards your feet, Your whole skull is also tilting down towards your feet in the same direction, which is going to decompress the back of your neck. So find your full range here and feel your whole spine articulating into extension, lifting off the floor. Pause here and take a full breath in and out. And now I want you to posterior tilt your pelvis. So you're going to roll towards the top of your pelvis and feel your lower back press down into the floor. Try to do this without squeezing your butt. This is not a glute bridge. The movement should be coming from your spine, not from pushing into the floor. So access the muscles that control the spine. These are the abdominal muscles right now, primarily. So feel your lower back pressing into the floor, pelvis tucking under like your pubis is coming to meet your nose. Feel your rib cage moving down at the front towards your pelvis and closing. And if you just let your head react naturally to that, you should feel your chin slightly lifting towards the ceiling as it rocks backwards. Remember, your skull and your pelvis should be moving the same direction. So if your pelvis is rocking towards your head in the direction of your head, then your head is rocking in the direction of your head. That's kind of weird. Your head is rocking back, lifting your chin up, lifting the back of your neck from the floor. Pause here. Try to make a whole back print into the floor. And breathe in and out. We're going to do 2 more cycles. Now, as you roll into your anterior tilt, I want you to be really clear that you're rolling, not sliding on the floor. There's a big difference. So don't scrub the floor with your pelvis by sliding on it like this. This is not what we're after. That's going to over-compress your lumbars a little bit more than we like. So think of it like a rocking chair. Rock down onto the tip of your pelvis, down to the bottom. You might have a lot less movement than you think you do, and that's totally cool. We're not looking for a huge anterior tilt. Feel how your whole spine lifts off the floor, and I want you to identify which segments of your spine are moving a little bit less. Where are you a little bit more stiff? For most of us, that's in the thoracic spine. So see if you can add a little bit more movement into your thoracic spine so you're peeling off the floor. Let your head rock down so your chin's tucking towards your chest. Your back of your neck's going down to the floor, decompressing. Take a full breath in and out. Stretching open the front of the body. This is where our abdominals get the chance to load so they can contract, which happens as we posterior tilt the pelvis, rock onto the top of your pelvis. Feel your lumbar spine pressing into the floor. Feel all your organs pressing down towards your spine and your spine pressing down into the floor, full lumbar flexion. I want you to make sure you're not squeezing your legs, squeezing your calves, squeezing your butt. Find this movement from the spine. Visualize your spine moving here. Your rib cage is going down towards your pelvis, making a full spine flexion. And if you just let your neck relax, your head should naturally tilt chin up to the ceiling. Breathe in and out here. And we'll do 1 more cycle going a little bit deeper into this range of motion. Rock all the way towards the bottom of your pelvis. Rock, don't slide. Don't make friction on the floor. Gently rock. Feel your whole spine creating a rainbow shape. This is extension of your spine. Let your chin tuck. Back of your neck moving towards the floor. Tune into the areas of your spine that are a little sticky. And breathe in and out. And let's go the other way. Last one, tuck your pelvis, rocking onto the top of your pelvis. Feel your lumbar spine pressing down into the floor. Rib cage moving down towards your pelvis bones, shortening the abdominal muscles. Let your chin rock up to the ceiling and the back of your neck lift away from the floor. So we're exploring the full spectrum of motion we have here at the pelvis and how the pelvis interacts with the spine and the neck. And let that go. Slowly come onto your side and we'll make our way up to your feet. And we'll move along into our next exercise. So exploring those two spectrums of motion will allow you to find your neutral pelvis. Neutral pelvis is somewhere between your two spectrums. And often the best way to show our body where neutral is to explore the two spectrums and let it calibrate on its own. Our bodies are so smart. When we try to force our bodies to do things, they end up fighting against us. But when we show our body, you can do this, find your own middle. Our bodies really like to do that and respond a lot better. So as you're standing here, notice if your foot pressures feel a little bit different already. For some of you, you might be feeling more centered on your feet, which might mean we have a little bit more of a centered position of your pelvis. So now we're going to go through that same cog motion, standing, and we're going to feed in movement into our thighs. So we're going to reinforce the proper relationship of the femurs and the pelvis doing these two motions into internal and external rotation. All right, let's do it. I'm going to face sideways so you can see. Maybe I'll face this way. This is my bad side. Okay, so let's begin by doing that same anterior tilt. Now I want you to make sure that when you're doing this anterior tilt, you're thinking about your pelvis bones going forwards and down. Try not to just stick your tailbone up and back. That's not what we're after. That's going to feel not very nice. Think instead rolling your pelvis bones at the front, forwards and down, spilling the soup. Now I want you to notice what just happened to your knees. Did you bend your knees or did they lock straight? I want you to slightly unlock your knees. And I want you to allow the weight to come onto the insides of your feet. And I want you to gently allow your knees to move towards each other. Don't force it, just really subtly. Think knees coming 1 centimeter towards each other, rotating your legs internally. Visualize you're standing on those two towels and you're trying to twist the towels inwards. So what you should be feeling is your pelvis anterior tilts, femurs internally rotating, ankles internally rotating, knees bending slightly, pressure going onto the insides of your feet. Now, as you're doing this, I want you to stay stacked up. So you're not letting your butt get behind you. You're not putting your ribcage in front of you. You want to eliminate those movements. So stay as stacked as you can, and then let it go. Let's go the other way. So I'd like you to do a posterior tilt. Take your pelvis, tip it back and down, or back and up. So pelvis bones up and back, spilling the soup out the back of the bowl. And I want you to reinforce the feeling of your femurs externally rotating in the sockets. Like you're trying to twist those towels out again. Your knees should straighten as you do this. So if you're bending your knees like this to tuck your pelvis, try to go only as far as you can with your knees straight. You want your knees to be straight. Feel the rotation coming into your lower leg and ankles, everything rotating out. So posterior tilt the pelvis, externally rotate the thighs, straighten the knees, externally rotate the ankles. Your weight should be going to the outsides of your feet. Your feet are supinating here. Stay stacked up. Don't let yourself shift forwards. And let that go. To make sure we're staying stacked up, here is the trick you can use. Put one finger just at the bottom of your sternum bone on your xiphoid process. Put another finger, if you're okay to touch yourself, put a finger just at the bottom of your pelvis on your pubic symphysis here, on your pubis. Now, you should feel how those two spots are stacked over top of each other. One's not forwards of the other. I want you to try to do this anterior tilt, keeping your fingers stacked up on top of each other. So anterior tilt the pelvis. Start to allow both of your thighs to internally rotate towards each other, keeping your pelvis and your rib cage on top of each other. Let your knees unlock. Don't lock your knees. And let the weight come onto the insides of your feet. Do the reverse. Posterior tilt your pelvis. So you should be feeling these two fingers now moving towards each other, vertically, but staying stacked up. As you posterior tilt your pelvis, we want your knees to be straight, your thighs to be externally rotating, and your pressure going to the outside of your feet. Are all these joint relationships happening for you right now? Where are your blocks? And really focus in there and see if you can allow these things to happen. Don't force it, just gently nudge things in the right direction. One more time, we'll do 3 rounds. Keeping your fingers stacked up, so don't let your butt get back behind you. It's a quite different feeling if you're doing this stacked up. This is important to make sure that our diaphragm is in a good position for us to also breathe. Diaphragm of the rib cage stacked on top of the diaphragm of the pelvis, so that when we breathe, we have good mechanics there, but that's a whole other workshop. So feel your legs internally rotating in the sockets. Really visualize that. Tune into the feeling of your legs rotating in. Knees bending slightly. And the pressure going onto the insides of your feet. So your feet are pronating a little bit. The pressure should also be traveling more towards the front of your feet than to the back of your feet. If your weight's going into your heels, you're probably locking your knees and sticking your butt back. So we don't want that. Now, posterior tilt. Last round, straighten your knees. If you're posteriorly tilting, really purely, you should feel like the front of your hips get a stretch open. So the hips will be extending if you're really, truly getting a posterior tilt with your knees straight. Your legs are externally rotating. Tune into the tops of your thighs, giving them a twist out. Still stacked up. Finger on your rib cage, finger on your pubis are stacked over each other. Diaphragms stacked. And let's just take a little break there. All right. So I want to show you an exercise that our intention is to load up the muscles at the back of the hip at the exact moment in time and how it would happen when we're walking. So we're probably only going to go through one leg today, just for the sake of time. So I'm going to invite you to do the other leg later. So let's choose your leg, the one that you think needs the most help. So I'm going to choose my left leg, which always needs the help. So it's my bad side. So maybe I should do my right leg so I have a good demo leg. I don't know. I'll do my bad leg. So you can see me struggle. So let's do this movement here in which we'll be rotating our pelvis towards the leg we're working on. And I'll just talk you through this. So this movement, we want to be twisting from the pelvis. And do you remember in the check-ins, in the assessment, I mentioned when your pelvis rotates towards a leg, that thigh should also be turning out in the socket. So I want you to tune into the feeling of that. We're going to use your pelvis as a handle, as a lever. As you twist your pelvis, it should bump into your femur and start to rotate your femur in the socket with you. So let's see if you can tune into that. As your pelvis twists towards that leg, do you get the sense of your whole thigh externally rotating with it? Now I want you to be very clear that when you're rotating your pelvis, you're staying in your tube. So you're not letting your butt go back behind you. So a little little posterior tilt of the pelvis. We just want kind of a neutral pelvis. So don't think about doing a crazy big posterior tilt, just enough to stay neutral. We definitely don't want your rib cage popping out and forwards. So try to stay still through your rib cage. And as you're doing this, I want you to be mindful that your knee is staying straight. If your knee is bending, we're going to be getting some twisting through the knee. Not the goal for this exercise. We really want to feel that as you're twisting towards this leg, the movement of the pelvis rotating is twisting this leg externally. Now, you should be able to feel this whole external rotation trickling down into your ankle. What we're looking for here is a supinated foot. So a few things to watch for a supinated foot, which is really important for accessing hip external rotation. We want to feel the pressure in your foot going towards the outside and the back of your foot, not staying on the inside. If the weight's on the inside of your foot is staying pronated. That's going to block how well you can rotate through the hip. You can just try that. Try rotating and letting your weight travel to the outside of your foot, and then try to lock the weight down to the inside of your foot and rotate, and notice how much that blocks you. So here we're allowing our foot to supinate. Supination also means that your ankle is going to be rotating outwards. So I want you to see, can you feel, look down and see and feel your ankle rotating outwards along with your whole leg. So what that will look like if there was a laser beam pointing at the front of this squishy part of your ankle here. As you twist, that laser beam should be twisting off towards your pinky toe. So can you feel if that's happening for you? Now, another thing we want to see is your arch peeling up off the floor and lifting up a little bit. So let's see if you can see that on my foot. This isn't my most reliable foot, but as I twist that foot that's on the ground there, it's lifting the arch up off the floor. So the arch is contracting a little bit. These motions all should happen as we walk. This is actually simulating a mid-stance phase of gait. All the joint mechanics that should be happening when we get to mid-stance. So everything kind of neutral in the gait cycle. A snapshot in time. I want you to make sure, just one last point, that as you're twisting here, you're not hyperextending your knee either. So we want to think about your knee staying stacked over your heel, not bending, not locking straight. So what you should be feeling right now, muscularly, is some stretchy stuff at the back of the hip in the external rotators in the piriformis. And you might also feel some stretching in the hip flexors at the front of the hip. Because if you're keeping your pelvis tucked under a little bit, you will feel those hip flexors stretching. And interestingly, even though we're externally rotating the femur, because the pelvis is twisting a little bit further than the leg is going, we should be getting a stretch for the external rotators of the hip. We're actually internally rotating the hip here. Remember how I said we can have an internally rotating hip even though the femur is externally rotating? I think I said that. I said something like that. So here, I want you to visualize your pelvis actually twisting a little farther than your femur is going. That extra twist of the pelvis is going to allow you to get some loading into the external rotators of the hip, the piriformis and friends back there. So if you're feeling that kind of deep hip stretch, deep in the glutes, you're getting this. You're getting that hip internal rotation. But at the same time, we're rotating the femur externally. It's a little bit of a mind thing. But this is loading up the hip external rotators so that we can use them better. This rep that you're doing here, supinating foot, straight knee, pelvis rotating towards the leg. Thigh is externally rotating, but because they're pelvis, we're trying to rotate a little bit further on top of our femur. We're going to get an internal rotation of the hip, and we're going to get a bit of a stretch in the hip external rotators and the hip flexors, TFL and friends. Okay, so I want you to go for a little walk around on that. We want to go for a stroll around after doing these movements so that they can integrate a little bit into your walking cycle. Okay, I'm just going to check in case these notes that people are writing to me are important. Sound is a bit wonky. Okay, so let me just turn off my microphone and see if that actually works better for you guys, okay? How do I turn this thing off? Okay, so is that better with the sound? Did you like it better? Let me talk from back here. Is this better or worse than with the microphone?
Can you hear me? It seems just fine, Monica.
I'm gonna assume it's okay because no one's saying anything, so I'm just gonna guess that this is okay. It's okay, better. Okay, so better without the microphone. That's all right. Just let me know if things change. All right, so that was our hip internal rotation to load up the external rotators. Next, we're going to explore the moment in time when we walk where the hip is in the most external rotation it gets to. So I want you to go into a split stance, and you're gonna put, we're gonna put the leg that you wanna work with behind you. So be about hip width apart, a comfortable stance, not too stretched out like you're doing the splits, just something comfortable where you could stand here and chill out. Now what we're going for is we're going to both externally rotate the femur here, and we're going to be doing a bit of a rotation with the pelvis. So both structures are going to be rotating the same direction, but let me walk you through step by step. So we want to set up our back foot in a supinated position. Supination couples with external rotation of the hip. So lift your back heel just a little bit, and I want you to think of straightening your back knee. And just put a little pressure into the outside of your foot, into the pinky toe side versus the inside of the foot. So you're not pronating your foot and rolling in on the ankle. You should feel like your ankle is externally rotating just a little bit, like you're twisting it out. Both feet should be pointing straight to the front. So don't twist your back foot out, try to point it straight forward. Otherwise, you're just twisting your foot. We're not actually accessing the hip. All right, knee is straight. What I want you to do is take your pelvis, and we're going to go again into a bit of a posterior tilt. So bring your pelvis underneath your head and posterior tilt. Think of bringing your pubis up towards your nose, but try to do that without bending your back knee. So here we're just getting a hip extension, a hip flexor stretch. And I want you to make sure that you're also slightly rounding your lower back. Don't go into a big kyphotic position, but just make sure you're not thrusting your rib cage forwards. So we're just posteriorly tilting the pelvis, finding a bit of a hip flexor stretch. Just go into that for a moment and then let it go. Now we want to turn this into a bit of a hip external rotation exercise. So we're just purely getting hip extension here, opening up the front of the hip, which is very important because we need hip extension to access our full turnout. But I also want to add in some rotation to this for you guys. So let's find that position where you are posteriorly tilting, find that hip flexor stretch, knee is straight back there. And I want you to visualize now your femur rotating outwards in the socket without twisting your back foot on the floor. So really hold on to that posterior tilt. Hold on to that hip flexor stretch. Don't lose those two things. And just ever so slightly think of turning your femur in the socket without moving your pelvis. So that differentiation of your femur from your pelvis. And as you do that, what you should start to feel is that hip flexor stretch turning into more of an adductor, inner thigh stretch. And that's your indicator that you're getting the right motion of the femur, turning outward. So do that a few times. Posterior tilt your pelvis. Let me find it. Whoa, balance. Find a different angle. So posterior tilt, keep the back knee straight. Slightly round your lower back to make sure that you're not just leaning forwards or leaning backwards. Hold that tuck. Slightly externally rotate your thigh in the socket. That should give you a nice sense of opening across the front of your hip and the inner thigh. Now, from here, let's pretend there's two headlights shining out the front of your pelvis. I want you to rotate those towards your back leg, but without moving your upper body. So from the front view, what that looks like is I'm keeping my shoulders to the front, rotating my femur out in the socket without moving my pelvis, and then I'm going to start to rotate my pelvis out towards my back leg. So my two bones of my pelvis are now pointing either to 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock without moving my shoulders with me. So keep your shoulders to the front. You should start to feel how the more you rotate your pelvis to the side, it drags your femur deeper into an external rotation and ramps up that feeling of inner thigh stretch. Hold on to the tuck with your pelvis. Don't let it go. And relax. Let's do 2 more like that. So there's kind of a 3-step process to getting our maximum hip external rotation, which is, this is how it happens when we walk. So you should be able to do this with every step that you take. So first, tuck under your pelvis, posterior tilt. Find the hip flexor stretch, both your hip bones pointing to the front. Next, hold on to that, don't lose it. Slightly rotate out your thigh in the socket. Feel that turn into an adductor stretch. Third, rotate your pelvis towards that back leg, keeping your shoulders to the front. Hold on to the posterior tilt. Pelvis is still underneath your head. And you're going to feel how that rotation of the pelvis pulls your thigh further into an external rotation. Don't let your foot slide on the floor. Deepen your posterior tilt just a little bit, and you should have a nice full stretch across that hip. And let's do that one more time, because I'm getting a bit of a calf cramp, because if you're getting the whole leg to rotate, you're going to be mobilizing some tissues in the lower leg at the same time. So posterior tilt the pelvis. Find that hip flexor stretch, pelvis pointing to the front. Next, once you have that hip flexor stretch with a posterior tilted pelvis, rotate your thigh out in the socket. It's like a pencil turning in the pencil sharpener. And then finally, twist your pelvis towards your back foot without moving your shoulders, without letting your pelvis get out from behind you or out from under you. Keep you 2 points of contact on the floor and the back foot. So don't let your foot twist on the floor. That's not actually your hip twisting. This should be a lovely hip flexor and inner thigh experience. Breathe in and out, let it go, and go for a walk around. Okay. So just take stock for a moment, stand and let your body settle. You're gonna feel imbalanced since we're only doing one side. But you can go ahead after this and do your other leg at your own time. Now our last movement to explore hip external rotation is going to be with the leg forwards. And this is going to be on a bent knee with the foot doing a pronation. So in the last 2 exercises, we had the foot supinating. In this exercise, the foot is going to be pronating, which is not a bad thing to happen. It's only bad if you get stuck like that and can't control it and have no other options. So I'll talk you through what a healthy pronation that is useful for the body looks like. So 1 foot forwards, 1 foot back. So your working leg is forwards. We're going to start by bending your front knee. And I just want you to get the sense of when you bend your front knee and put your weight forwards on that foot, where does the weight go in your foot? Do you roll onto the inside of your foot, or do you go onto the outside of your foot? What's happening for you? What we'd like to happen as you put your weight forwards is naturally your front foot should pronate, which means that the arch should lower into the floor and all the muscles on the bottom of the foot should stretch out. This is useful for if we're looking to absorb shock when we walk through the foot. The arch should lower and lift with every step that we take. So we're just checking if your foot can do that. So to encourage a little bit more pronation and also external rotation at this hip, we're going to start to twist our pelvis away from that foot. So it's almost like a yoga warrior stance. Don't worry about your back foot for now. Let it do what it's going to do. You just want to twist your pelvis. So from the front view, a couple of key points to notice is as you're doing this, we want to keep 3 points of contact on your front foot. So we know what the foot tripod is, most of us. It's the 3 points are the first metatarsal, the fifth metatarsal, pinky toe and the big toe side, and the heel. So we always want to have those 3 points of contact on the floor, even though we're pronating. So pronation doesn't mean dumping your knee so far in that the outside of your foot lifts off. That's not pronation. That's just, I don't even know what to call that without using a bad word. And I don't know if there's people that are young here, so I'm gonna try not to be my usual swearing self. So we don't want your foot rolling completely onto the inside edge. So notice if that's happening for you. Try to twist your pelvis, but keep your tibia, your lower leg, stacked vertically. You'll feel the pressure go more onto the inside of your foot, but we definitely don't want you dumping your knee all the way in. So can we dissociate that a little bit? Can we find that rotation with your pelvis, keeping your knee going down your big toe? Now let's talk about what the hip is doing here. I hope that you can feel that the space at the front of your hip, so the space between your pelvis and your femur, is getting bigger right now, which means this hip is externally rotating. The knee is bending. And this is where we do get a little bit of twisting in the knee. And that's not a bad thing. We need our knees to also be able to twist a little bit. So I want you to try to feel what's happening in your knees right now. As your knee is bending, can you feel how your thigh rotating in is creating a little bit of like a twisting motion at the knee? And so we want our knees to be bulletproof and be able to twist like this so that when we go ahead and do it in our dancing, it's already familiar with this movement. We're not just going to hit a limit right away. We have a little bit of freedom because this is a natural movement that our bodies should be able to do. Now I want you to try to get your two pelvis bones to rotate farther than your knee. I want you to separate your knee going in from your pelvis twisting. So we want your foot to be pronating, the weight to be going down onto the inside of your foot. See if you can sense that. See if you can sense your knee traveling just to the inside of your tip of your big toe, keeping 3 points of contact on your foot. Feel your foot spreading, getting longer and wider, like a pancake. Let your knee bend and let your thigh rotate internally. Something that often helps people, and I don't know how this happens, is something to do about the areas of the brain where the arm and the leg are pretty close to each other or something, but when people twist their arm in, it actually encourages rotation in the femur. So what you can try here is just take the arm of the front leg and rotate it in, and that's almost gonna tell your leg to rotate in a little bit more. And remember that idea of your femur can be rotating in, but because your pelvis is rotating a little farther, you're still opening up into external rotation. So this happens at a very particular moment in time when you walk. And if you're getting tired like I am, let's just do one more rep. This happens to absorb shock when we walk, this specific movement. Now this is a little bit modified for the purpose of exaggerating the external rotation. If your knee's dumping in like mine, try to press it out, but let the weight go down onto the inside of the foot. See if you can do those two motions that seem opposite, but they should be able to happen. Okay, walk it off, walk it in. Ooh. And we're just going to take stock now. I had this plan of doing some other movements that are dance specific, but you can literally take any dance specific turnout exercises you want. And in theory, having done this, given your body back some of its human movement potential to access external rotation and internal rotation, you should in theory have a little bit more access to your hip, and you should be able to take this new potential and do anything you want with it and get more out of it. So we're going to test out how things feel now. So just tune into your foot pressures. Does anything feel different? I'm feeling a lot of pulsing in my hips because I think a lot of blood flow has just been pumped through that whole leg, which is probably a useful thing. I work with people sometimes, and the first time I see them, they have, like, their feet are a different color than the rest of their leg. They don't have very good circulation because there's some restrictions in the leg. And they have like weird skin texture and weird coloration of their foot. And then after doing some movement and literally pumping blood through the leg and getting the joints to move again, I come back and see them the next time, like maybe the next week, and their foot's a different color because they actually have blood flow. It's kind of amazing sometimes. Anyway, so make any little notes about where the pressure in your feet is different. And I want you to grab your towels now, or your fluffy slippers, and let's recheck that functional turnout test. So grab your phone and camera also so that you can snap an after photo. And I just want you to know, I don't have very high expectations that anyone's gonna have crazy changes or anything. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and you might notice a little difference, and that'll give you something to work on. Or you might notice that this was exactly something for you that freed up some extra movement. All right, so stand in the same spot. Remember that we only did one side, so you might only see difference on one side. And I want you to now start by rotating from the tops of your hips. I'm laughing because I can feel how much more free my left hip is. And remember, we're doing this without compensation, so don't go into your compensations. Just try to find that extra or whatever turnout you have from the hips, and then take a snapshot. Make sure you're not twisting your pelvis bones straight to the front. And you can't see this, but my right foot, the one that I wasn't working on, is pointing out maybe 20 degrees, and my left foot is now pointing out 45 degrees. So I gained quite a bit of range there. So that's kind of cool. Now we can also check out the assessments lying on the floor. So if you'd like to do that now, we can do that. So lie on your back. And we can do both legs, because sometimes you work on one leg and it actually affects the other one too. Stabilize your femur, keep it vertical. Let's go into external rotation. And for me on this leg, the biggest limitation was internal rotation. So I'm going to go now, and whoa, I have maybe 4 extra degrees. For me, that's big. So check out your other leg too. See if you have any differences. My right hip feels like it's actually getting a little bit more range of motion as well. Not really into internal, but my left hip, or my right hip actually, the one I wasn't working on, feels a little bit more free also. So that's interesting. Okay. So just a few things I want to say is that this is definitely not the whole picture. There are many other things that one can do and probably should do as part of a movement practice to optimize turnout. We didn't talk about your core. We didn't talk about your breathing. We didn't really talk about strengthening stuff. So there's a lot of other things that one can do, but this is my perspective coming at it specifically from optimizing joint biomechanics. So I'd like now to yeah, so I'd just like to take a moment now. If there's any questions or anything, I think we should just do a little chat. So if you have any questions or observations, please type those into the chat box. I realize we've been going pretty long here. That's how I roll. When I get going, I just lose track of time and keep going. So we'll try to keep this at about 10, 15 minutes max. If anyone has any observations, like how did that go for you? Did you notice a difference? Did you not notice a difference? How did those exercises feel? Do you have any questions about those specific exercises? I'd love to know what you noticed, what you felt, and how maybe I can help you to troubleshoot some things about this turnout troubleshoot. So just type anything into the chat box whenever you want. Yes, Sonia, your body does the opposite of what is considered normal. That's funny. Yeah, mine did too. I was all wonky. Okay, cool. That's great to hear, Callie. The pictures don't show a difference much, but your leg feels like it's turning out easier. So that's what I mean by you might not notice a total absolute improvement in the turnout range of motion, but your ability to use it more easily is what you might feel. And that was certainly true for me. Like, because I don't dance very much anymore and I don't necessarily work on my turnout, in dance classes, I noticed a big difference in my range because I don't do this very often. So any little input will probably give me a big result. But for someone like, I know Callie, that you dance pretty regularly, so you use your turnout pretty regularly. So you might not notice a big difference in the range, but you might notice a difference in the ease because you're not forcing it as hard to get the same result. So it's taking a lot of pressure and strain off your system, if that makes sense at all. So that's cool. Feel better in the hips. That's great. I think that because these movements aren't necessarily specific to dancers, they're specific to human beings. Any human being can do these movements and feel better in their hips. In my liberated body workshops, I actually have a couple of people, one who's getting a hip replacement somewhere in the next couple of years probably, but she's trying to delay the process of deterioration with doing exercise. And I have another client who just last year got a hip replacement and he's doing his work now to help his hips stay healthy, because you can get a hip replacement and then not do any exercises and you'll just keep having the same problems because you're not really doing anything with your body to help the situation. And so I don't know where I was going with that. Just that these movements are useful for any human being with hips, regardless of whether or not you are a dancer and use turnout. So is there any other questions or observations from anyone? Oops, let me just go back to the chat box there. Okay, so I'm reading Sophia Marengo's question, and it's okay. English is not your first language. That's totally cool. Spanish isn't my first language. I can't even speak Spanish. So it's important to underline that the improvement we made today will maintain only if we add these movements during your daily trainings. Yes and no. So the cool thing about these movements, because they're intended to integrate with the gait cycle, your body will take some of this and recognize it as, oh, this is useful. I should be able to do this. And you'll be able to hang on to some of these improvements if they're not things that are being influenced by other factors like previous injuries or repetitive habits that you do daily to undo these improvements you've made. So for example, if you have habits that, like you're just hammering a nail into your hand all day and you put a Band-Aid on it and you expect that nail to not hurt anymore, like that's not very logical. So, but if you take that nail out and then you do the movements to heal that wound or whatever, you let the wound heal, and then you never add any negative input back into it again, then technically you shouldn't need to really do anything daily to heal that wound. It just heals on itself and it's good. But if you're continuing to do stuff that works in the opposite direction of these movements. So for example, if you, I don't know what you do, but if you do stuff that messes with your hips, being able to access these motions, then yeah, you probably will want to do these as part of a daily practice, just to hang on to this new movement potential. For me personally, my left hip, I have a lot of problems. So personally, like I have a lot of problems with my body that I need to stay on top of. If I do my work daily, I don't feel those problems. That doesn't mean I'm better. It means I can stay on top of it. I can manage the situation. But I think for some of us, we can do these exercises and we can legitimately get better and not have to do them anymore. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that's a very individual answer. You might need to do these daily. You might need to do these just only after you do dance or before you do dance. You might need to only do these as like a warm-up or a movement preparation or an unwind. Or you might need to do these once a week. You can kind of tinker and see what frequency of doing these allows you to hang on to the improvements. But the cool thing is now you have a set of assessment tools you can use to ascertain for yourself whether or not you need to do these things. So if you notice that your assessments are kind of moving back into the direction that you were in before, that isn't as good as it is now, then maybe you want to just add a little bit more of this new input to your body. I hope that made sense. I really don't know if I'm communicating that well. Okay, thanks, Sophia. I'm glad it was interesting. Okay, so from Kira, in the parallel fourth working back leg, should the front leg be bent? And why do we feel a calf cramp? I love that you called it parallel fourth because I'm so not in ballet mode. So I was like, parallel fourth. Oh yeah, that is kind of like a parallel fourth position. So that's cool. So should the front leg be bent? Yes, a little bit bent. And why do we feel a calf cramp? So the calf cramp might be happening because as you're lifting that back heel off the ground, you're actually going to be contracting the muscles of the lower calf. So you can think about it as, let's just see if I can show this. Am I on camera here? Yeah. So you can think about it as this sort of action. So with the leg behind you like this lifting of the calf is actually a plantar flexion of the ankle, which is the same thing as going like this. So it actually will be contracting these lower calf tissues, the soleus, the Achilles tendon, that area will all be contracting when you lift the back heel. And because you're using it very actively, it's not passive, it's very active and in harmony with the rest of the body. So it's quite a bit of work. So you might feel a bit of that cramping for that reason. Second reason you might feel cramping is because the foot is supinating. You're getting this external rotation in the calf. So in particular, if you feel some cramping and burning along the side of your leg, that's a sign that you're getting your foot to supinate, and these muscles along the side of your leg, they're actually loading and creating that burning sensation. I hope that made sense. So it's not a bad sign, it's actually quite a good sign. Now, if the cramping that you're feeling is like a really exceptional stretch at the top of your calf, that's because of the knee being straight. When the knee straightens, it stretches out the muscles behind the calf. And again, because we're doing this under load, we're doing it really actively with our body resistance. It's not a passive stretch. The back of the calf lengthening under load, under our body's load, it will feel a little bit more burny and crampy because it's not a passive stretch, it's an eccentric load that's teaching the body to do something different. Okay, I hope that made sense. I'm just going on to Rachel. I have decent turnout when leg raised at hip level, but not when legs are down straight. So the difference there is when your legs are up in that 90 angle. It's a flexion of the hip. And for some people, they find that when their hips are flexed, they have just a bit better access to that hip external rotation. So when you're standing, this requires that your hips be extended. So the extension of the hip means you're flat at the front of the hip here, and the muscles are open. The hip flexors are long. So if you are someone, I don't know if this is you, if this describes you at all, but if you're someone who is a bit like me, and when you try to do your turnout, you end up doing an anterior tilt, it could be that you're being pulled or you're biased to shortening the hip flexors as a way of accessing your hip external rotation, which means that when you're standing and the hips are extended and you should be able to stretch open the hip flexors, there's too much resistance to work against and it's hard to rotate the legs out. Now there could be other factors. For example, if you've had some ankle sprains or things, just the act of standing and being in a weight-bearing context with gravity means that there might be something from the knees down that is making it hard to rotate your legs out. So there might be some blockage at the ankle or at your knee. And just the fact that you're now standing weight bearing is bringing those issues up. So I can't say exactly what that is for you, but those would be two of the things that I would start with. And of course, take this all with a grain of salt because I don't know you and I don't want to tell you things that are untrue. So just pretend we're just hypothesizing and yeah, take it with a grain of salt. Callie says, just did the other side while listening. Good work. And my internal rotation went from literally 1 degree to now like 10 degrees on the lying back assessment. Cool, that was my experience as well. Yeah, super awesome. Great work. Lavinia, oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Lavinia is a dance educator and also has taken the anatomy and motion work. So I'm super honored to have her here. Thanks, Lavinia, for coming. Okay, Rachel, yes, you have some issues with the psoas and the left ankle. So those would be things to consider. I have a movement session that I did called the Ankle Sprain Retrospective. It's a movement deep dive session that I did for some of my movement students. And if you want to troubleshoot that left ankle and find some strategies for it, Rachel, just email me after. I'm happy to share that video with you as a thank you for coming today. Usually those videos are only for my students that are part of my online movement crew, Team Body Liberation Excellency. But I'm happy to share that video with you because I think it could be helpful for you if you're interested. So just shoot me an email. Okay, we're going to close down this Q&A now unless there's any other burning questions. And I just want to give you an invitation now. So I kind of briefly mentioned my workshop, Liberated Body, which goes through these mechanics in much more detail. And we go through it in 4 days. And we go through the feet in 1 day, the spine in 1 day, the hips in 1 day, and we go through the upper body in 1 day. And I think that if you enjoyed this work and you found it beneficial, then you'll really get a lot out of doing the full 4-day exploration of your body. I like to think of it as the user's manual to your body. If you were to understand what your whole body should be doing when you walk, what those mechanics are, this is where I am able to take you step by step through exploring those and giving them back to your body. So today we just did a little zoom into the transverse plane in the hip. But in my Liberated Body workshop, we go through all 3 planes of motion in the whole body over 4 days. So my next workshop is coming up on the 21st of September. It's 4 Mondays in a row. And I would love to offer you, if you want to sign up, here's a bonus for you today. If you sign up today, by the end of the day, I want to gift you one of my other hip sessions that I did 2 weeks ago that was all about hip extension. So it was a deep dive into hip extension, because for a lot of you, focusing on turnout is good, but you might need to access the other planes of motion in your hip. You might need to work on the extension of the hip. So like Rachel, we talked about, yeah, your psoas is a bit tight. In this movement deep dive, I go into all different strategies to access better hip extension, which will also help your external rotation because they should be happening together when we walk. They're a coupled relationship. So if you want to sign up today for my next workshop, then I also want to give you the bonus gift of getting access to that. It's a 90-minute movement session, kind of like this one, totally free. So if you want to do that, shoot me an email and I can send you the link to sign up for the workshop and get that free bonus. Okay, sound good? Cool. So after we hang up for today, what I'm gonna do is do a little draw this evening. 4 winners are gonna win one of those 4 prizes I did. And I don't know if she's here. Is Celine still here? Yeah. So Celine, she donated the, she's the neuroscience of dance. and she's donated her workshop coming up on October 24th that blends neuroscience and dance. So since you're here, Celine, do you want to just say a few quick words about your workshop to get us stoked about it and understand what you're teaching? Because it sounds really cool. So just you can turn on your mic if you want and say a few quick words. Go for it, Celine. There we go.
Hello, hi everyone. Hi.
Unmute.
So I'm doing a workshop on the neuroscience of dance, and all that we've learned today was really interesting because Monica asked me neuroscientifically, what could I say to help out? And I mentioned a lot proprioception and us accepting our own bodies as they are, and discovering our own bodies, because we are all different, and our brains are different and our bodies are different, and they process information differently, and it's important to tune in into those natural reflexes that each individual person has in order to be able to do any movement, not just the turnout. And all of those things I teach in my workshop. I teach a lot about equilibrium, execution, memorizing choreographies, perceiving movement better. And I give tips and techniques during the workshop that everyone can apply. And all of that applies to the turnout, but it applies to everything in dance.
Cool. Thanks, Celine. So she generously donated one free spot in her workshop. I think it's like 40 pounds, 50 pounds, something like that.
50, yes.
50 pounds, yeah. So it's very generous, very generous. So that's online. So it's cool that Zoom is allowing us to do these online workshops and learn with different people. And it's cool. The world is opening up a little bit, and we're all maybe heading back to the dance studio. So we kind of need to ease our bodies back into doing some healthy movement practices. So I hope you'll be able to take some of the stuff that I showed you today, and for those 4 lucky ones of you who get access to these cool movement online programs, I hope you'll just be able to add more and more tools to your toolkit, both from your brain down and your body out. And I mean, I think I've been talking for about 2 hours now here, so, and I feel like I could keep going because I've drank enough coffee. And I love this stuff. I love exploring the body. I think it's so fascinating. And yes, Lavinia, to segue into answering your question. Yes, if you can't make the times for my workshop because it's at, like everyone's kind of working again. So if you can't make those times, I have recordings, so you can always catch up week to week. So thank you. Yes. So thank you, everybody. I think we'll wrap up here. I really appreciate you coming out. I thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you got something out of this. I would love to hear how it went for you. So please shoot me an email. Shoot me an email just to let me know how it went, to ask any questions. If you have before and after photos that are cool, I would love to see them. I'll show you mine so you can see the difference between my left foot that started here and then went out like that. So send me your photos. I'd be super curious. Even if you didn't get a difference, like it's still kind of cool to see if it didn't work for you. Like that's good to know too. Like that's good information if something didn't work for you. So send me a message about that. And if you are interested in trying out my Liberated Body workshop, send me an email so I can give you the information for how to register for it and get your free bonus. Okay, so look out for an email from me tomorrow with the recording of this session and for who the winners are. And I'm also going to be posting the video of me pulling the thing out of the hat on my Instagram story, because I mean, we got to do what we got to do to promote our online stuff right now. And as much as I don't like online marketing, we got to do these things. So I'm going to make it fun. And I'm going to pull out the names from the hat. So check out my story later on tonight or whatever time it is for you. And I'll send you an email tomorrow if you won. So good luck to you all. Okay. And that's enough talking because you've got lives to live. So peace out. You can follow me at Mon Volkmar on Instagram if you don't have me already. Mon Volkmar. Okay. Have a great day, guys. Thanks for hanging out with me. Take care.